The story begins when a man purchased an old farmhouse in Ohio, not knowing that the property he was about to own carried within it a secret that had been hidden from the world for nearly a century. When he first set foot inside, he admired the rustic architecture, the worn wooden floors, the smell of dust and history lingering in every corner. And he thought about all the memories that had passed through those walls. What he did not realize at that moment was that beneath his feet there was a hidden chamber bricked off for 91 years, untouched by human eyes, locked away like a time capsule of darkness. Curiosity often takes root in small details, and he noticed something strange in the basement. The bricks along one wall were different in texture and color compared to the others. They seemed newer, as if someone had sealed off a section with great effort. He ran his hand across the rough surface, wondering why anyone would close off part of a basement. After all, in rural Ohio during the early 20th century, basements were vital for storage of crops, tools, and supplies. Yet here was a section deliberately hidden from sight and sealed so securely that it raised questions that could not be ignored at night as the wind howled through the cracks of the old farmhouse. The man found himself staring at the memory of those bricks, his mind spinning with possibilities. Perhaps it was nothing more than an old repair job. Perhaps the previous owners simply wanted to close off an unstable area. But the human imagination rarely accepts the simplest answers, and his grew restless with thoughts of treasure, secret rooms, and buried stories. After days of hesitation, he gathered tools, determined to find out what was on the other side of the wall with each strike of the hammer. The sound echoed through the basement like a drumbeat awakening history. Dust filled the air as fragments of mortar crumbled to the ground. His heart pounded harder than his strikes, knowing he was undoing something that had been deliberately kept hidden for 91 years. Finally, with a final blow, a hole appeared, revealing a void, a pocket of darkness that swallowed the beam of his flashlight and reflected nothing but mystery. He widened the gap enough to crawl through, his breath caught in his chest as he crossed the threshold, stepping into a space no one had entered in generations. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of time and decay. Cobwebs clung to his face as he waved his light across the hidden room. What he saw made him freeze. The chamber was not empty. There were old crates stacked against the walls, rotting furniture toppled over, and personal belongings scattered as though someone had abandoned the place in great haste. Dust covered everything. Yet the arrangement suggested life had once existed here and then been abruptly sealed away. He crouched to examine the objects. An old journal with pages yellowed and brittle lay beside a lantern. Long, extinguished shoes, worn and cracked, rested near a broken rocking chair. Each item whispered a story, but none offered clarity. The bricked wall suddenly seemed less like protection from structural failure and more like a deliberate attempt to bury the memory of what had taken place here. He ran his fingers across the journal. Though fragile, the ink was still visible, telling fragmented entries of fear, uncertainty, and conflict. Words like, "They are coming and we must hide," leapt out, chilling. His blood, he could feel the desperation etched into every sentence. A family had once lived here, or perhaps sought refuge only to vanish, leaving behind echoes of their existence sealed away by bricks and silence for 91 years. As he turned the pages, his flashlight flickered, illuminating scratches on the wall behind the furniture, marks carved by human hands. Not random, but deliberate tally marks counting days or weeks, perhaps years, etched deeper as if by someone confined in despair. The realization struck him with the weight of horror. This basement had been more than a storage space. It had been a prison, or a place of last resort. Suddenly the cold air felt colder. The shadows stretched longer, and he could sense the haunting presence of those who once occupied the room. The man stumbled back through the opening, heart racing, torn between fascination and dread. The discovery had begun as curiosity, but now it felt like he had disturbed something meant to remain buried. He could not stop thinking about why the room was bricked up, who had lived or died inside, and why no one spoke of it for nearly a century. The farmhouse no longer felt like a simple home, but a vessel of secrets. Each creak of the floorboards above carried new meaning. Each gust of wind through the eaves sounded like a whisper from the past, and he realized that buying this farmhouse had tied him forever to the mystery of its hidden chamber and the souls that lingered in silence for 91 years. When the hidden basement was finally revealed after being sealed for 91 years, the true weight of its existence began to unfold. And what lay inside was not merely a collection of forgotten belongings, but a gallery of secrets frozen in, time that spoke louder than any words could. The man who had uncovered it found himself staring at artifacts that seemed ordinary at first glance. Yet each item carried with it an aura of untold history. A child's toy soldier carved from wood, chipped and faded, sat beside a cracked porcelain doll whose eyes seemed to follow every movement nearby. An iron bed frame lay rusting against the wall, its mattress long decayed, leaving behind only twisted springs like skeletal remains. The eerie silence was interrupted only by the faint drip of water echoing in the darkness and the heavy breath of the intruder, who knew that what he was seeing was not supposed to be seen. Not now. Not ever. In the corner sat crates nailed shut, yet weakened by time, and with trembling hands he pried one open to discover jars of preserved food, now spoiled but once carefully stored. As if for survival, there were tin cans labeled in brands long extinct, their logos barely legible through the rust and decay. These were not random objects, but provisions collected with intention, as though whoever had lived here or hidden here expected to be trapped for a long time. His attention turned to a wooden chest half buried in dust, and when opened, it revealed letters folded neatly and bound with twine. The handwriting faded but still readable, addressed to a family, with words filled with longing and fear. The letters spoke of conflict, of danger lurking outside, and of the need to remain hidden until it was safe again. The deeper he read, the clearer it became that this was not just a storage room, but a refuge, perhaps for a family or a group of people running from something greater than themselves. Each letter was a fragment of a desperate plea for hope against the backdrop of an unforgiving reality. More disturbing were the personal belongings left behind untouched for nearly a century. A pair of spectacles cracked at the lens sat atop a table beside a quill, and inkwell dried long ago. An unfinished letter remained on the desk, its final words cut off mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted forever. The flashlight beam quivered as the man's hands shook with the realization that this room was abandoned suddenly, not peacefully but urgently. Something had forced those who lived here to vanish, and someone else had taken great care to brick it all away, sealing both the memory and the evidence of their existence. As his exploration deepened, he noticed drawings etched into the stone walls, crude sketches of faces, homes, animals, and landscapes, each etched by a hand that must have been trapped within these walls for days or months or perhaps years. The childlike quality of the drawings suggested that a young soul had once endured the darkness, scratching images of light and freedom into the walls as a way of remembering what lay beyond the bricks. Yet alongside these innocent drawings were symbols, more sinister crosses, circles, and jagged lines carved, with precision, their meaning unclear but undeniably intentional. They suggested rituals or desperate prayers, attempts to make sense of suffering and fear, or to ward off whatever evil pressed in from outside. Standing there surrounded by relics of desperation and loss, the man could feel the silence pressing in on him. It was not the quiet of emptiness, but of voices that had once cried out only to be muffled by bricks and time. He tried to imagine the lives of those who had been trapped, hear what dangers they had faced in Ohio, 91 years ago, perhaps violence or persecution, perhaps a family secret, too dark to be spoken aloud, perhaps even something supernatural that haunted the house itself. He could not be certain. But what he did know was that these artifacts were not random. They were chosen. They were the belongings of people who had lived, breathed, hoped, and suffered in this very space. And their sudden absence told a story more haunting than any ghost tale, because it was real. The discovery changed everything. The farmhouse was no longer just property. It was a monument to hidden lives, a time capsule of pain and secrecy. Each object a piece of a puzzle, each scar on the wall a sentence in a story that no one alive could fully tell. He left the basement shaken yet unable to escape the pull of the mystery. And though he carried the items up one by one to study them further, he knew deep in his soul that these were not his possessions. They belonged to the silence, to the people who had been sealed away for nearly a century, and to the darkness that still lingered in the bricked-off basement, waiting to remind anyone who dared to enter that some secrets are buried for a reason, and once uncovered, they change everything forever. The dark history of the farmhouse began to reveal itself slowly as the man pieced together the fragments left in the bricked-off basement, and what emerged was a chilling story, not just of a house but of the people who had lived within its walls, and the reasons why part of it had been sealed for 91 years. Ohio in the early 20th century was a place of both opportunity and unrest. Rural families struggled to survive through harsh winters, economic hardship, and the social turmoil of a country shifting through eras of war, migration, and suspicion. The farmhouse had belonged to a family that appeared ordinary from the outside, hard-working people who tilled the soil, raised animals, and tried to live simple lives. But in the letters, journals, and scratched markings discovered in the hidden basement, a different reality unfolded. The family had been consumed by fear. Their words spoke of threats from outside forces, whispers of men who came at night, and the belief that the family was being hunted, whether for debts, personal vendettas, or darker reasons, remained unclear. But what was certain was that the family believed their lives depended on hiding beneath their own home. The chamber, once uncovered, showed signs of being a refuge turned into a tomb. The provision crates, the drawings, the tally marks all indicated that the family had lived there for an extended period, bricked away from the world above. But the question remained, who had bricked it and why, if the family had sealed themselves inside? Why was there no record of their return? Why were their belongings abandoned mid-use? And why did neighbors over the decades never speak of them? The silence surrounding the farmhouse became as much a part of its legacy as the bricks themselves, and this silence hinted at a darker truth. There were stories among old Ohio towns of families who disappeared without trace, of communities that closed ranks around secrets, and of histories buried because they were too painful or too dangerous to confront. It was possible the family had been victims of crime and the bricking was an attempt to conceal the evidence. It was equally possible that they were hiding from authorities or enemies, and that when they never emerged, someone sealed the basement to erase the shame or the horror of what had happened inside. Some of the writings found on the walls spoke of strange noises above, whispers of betrayal, and shadows that seemed to move across the cracks of the floorboards. The family wrote of feeling watched, of praying for deliverance, of nights filled with scratching sounds and mornings filled with silence. The possibility that paranoia had driven them into hiding could not be dismissed. Nor could the possibility that something genuinely sinister had haunted the house itself. What made the story even more disturbing was the longevity of the secret. 91 years meant multiple generations of owners had either ignored or deliberately concealed. The bricked wall property records showed changes of hands but never mentioned the sealed basement, suggesting that each new owner either never discovered it, or if they did, chose to remain silent, perhaps out of fear of what would be found inside, or perhaps out of a sense of responsibility to keep the darkness buried. The man who finally broke through the bricks thus became not only a discoverer, but also a witness to a story no one else had dared to face. And in doing so, he inherited the weight of that story. The farmhouse became less a home and more a haunting, its creaks and shadows carrying layers of memory. The discovery of the bricked-off basement suggested that history is not just written in books, but carved into walls and hidden behind mortar. It also suggested that some stories are silenced not by accident but by design. The dark history of the farmhouse was one of erasure, of deliberate forgetting, and of lives confined to silence for nearly a century as the man tried to sleep at night. The images from the basement played in his mind, the scratches on the wall, the unfinished letter, the child's drawing of sunlight. These were not just objects, they were testimonies. They were voices trying to speak across 91 years of silence. The man wondered whether he had done the right thing in tearing down the wall. For though he had uncovered the truth, he had also unleashed the weight of grief, fear, and mystery that came with it. And in the shadows of the farmhouse, he sometimes thought he heard whispers, not loud enough to understand, but present enough to remind him that the basement had been bricked off for a reason, and perhaps that reason was not just to keep the world out, but to keep something else. In the history of the farmhouse was not simply about one family. It was about how darkness can be buried and how even after 91 years, it can resurface, demanding to be remembered.